Good, yeah. I just transitioned over from ESPN where they were interviewing me about my sports career.
No way.
No, I'm kidding.
Wow, that is absolutely incredible. I mean, like, look at the star-studded guests that we get today,
Yeah,
across the board, across media distribution.
yeah,
Just
and I'm
shows the
on
caliber.
I'm on Bloomberg after this as well. It's a crazy day.
You've got Bloomberg after this. You've got to do ETFs as well. Don't forget that. Let's get you on 20 VC, and then most definitely the YC YouTube channel, without a shadow of doubt.
Obviously. How are you?
I'm holding my nerve. I'm doing okay. I'm doing okay. Everything seems to be falling apart, but we are slowly figuring this all out together. And I think that's the main thing.
I love
Uh,
it. It's so exciting to be live. This is my first time. I mean, I've been in plenty of meetings, but not broadcasts.
I think we've got audio. I think we're in a good place. I think we figured it out. Uh, I'm sure the chat will tell us if there are any issues, and I'll be absolutely ridiculed online in front of X million people. But Alex, welcome to Ventures. Thanks for taking your time for coming from ESPN. And before you go to Bloomberg, I've been looking forward to this conversation from when we first met. Dude, it's a pleasure.
Fantastic. I'm honestly so glad to be here. We've got half an hour to troubleshoot everything wrong with how entrepreneurs choose problems to solve.
I decided to
Um,
choose the problem with content, which is incredibly difficult because there are no real benchmarks for what great looks like.
Yeah, no, it's wild. It's a bit of a wild west.
Tell me about Problem Kit. Give me an intro to yourself for the stream, and then we can dive into the questions. I have stacks.
Sure. Okay. So a bit about me and Problem Kit because they're basically the same thing. I am Problem Kit for all intents and purposes. So I'm actually a neuroscientist originally, by educational background, and I went into the pharmaceutical industry. GSK, big pharmaceutical company, mostly makes vaccines, but also sort of like oncology drugs. Um, And in GSK, I ended up in a sort of new innovation team that had this really broad, really interesting remit to essentially, in my words, map strategic threats and opportunities for pharma coming from digital and digital health, and then seed new innovation opportunities. And that turned into sort of experimenting with various venturing concepts. I left that to then join an incubator. I went to Zinc VC's incubator program, which was like just a different kind of entrepreneurship context. It's a different kind of environment designed to sort of curate the innovation process and like make it happen repeatedly, which was really interesting. So I sort of took those two experiences together and thought, okay, well, what are the patterns that I've noticed here? What keeps going wrong in both environments? And I noticed a sort of actually quite, in some ways, controversial gap in the entrepreneurship playbook that didn't used to be there and is more of a recent phenomenon in my view. And that is that entrepreneurs are consistently and voluntarily choosing to solve problems that they are not necessarily proximal to. And what I really mean by that is problems that they haven't experienced directly themselves. And yet, this is some of the most time-tested advice coming out of VCs, and certainly those VCs that have succeeded through the Web 2 movement, all professing this idea of scratching your own itch and solving your own problems. So I started to dig into why that keeps happening, both in a corporate innovation or corporate entrepreneurship environment, but also in lots of incubators. And I sort of traced it back to essentially design thinking as a great methodology, and I love design thinking. I have a minor qualification in design thinking, but what design thinking does is it essentially prescribes empathy to corporates that have established markets already, right? It's like just be more empathetic for your users and try and put yourself in their shoes. Because if you work in a large established corporate, you don't always have the luxury of being your own customer, right? Your product teams, your marketing teams don't, you can't just hire in your customers and have a company entirely staffed, especially in healthcare, right? Where you're like, you're developing drugs for people with like really, in some cases, drugs for really serious diseases, but that only a few people have. It's like you can't staff a pharmaceutical company full of people that have those diseases. So like this empathy prescription works really well in like a corporate context. But then what I see as the issue is people leaving corporate to start ventures for themselves and in the startup scene, and then they copy the same approach of essentially building empathy for some other user that is not necessarily themselves. So that was the sort of impetus. That was the beginning of Problem Kit, and I thought, there's something, there's some corrective methodology, there's some process that I can put in place here that guides people essentially towards discovering problems in their own lives that they're really well positioned to solve as a starting point.
I have so many questions right now. I want to start right at the beginning. Why neuroscience?
Truthfully, so there's two reasons. The first one is, so I was choosing my degree in sort of 2012, 2013, and this was before what we would consider, I guess, the recent boom in AI and certainly generative AI. And I partly on the principle that I assumed developments in AI would largely be informed by progress in neuroscience as we understand more about how the brain functions, the same as how we design planes based on how birds fly, although birds don't have engines. Um, and so I just wanted to ride that wave. I thought if I'm not great, I'm not good enough at maths to go and do a computer science degree, so I'll go and do biology. I'll do the sort of biology side of computation, which is neuroscience.
I like the
And
way you think about that, the biology of computation versus the physics and the science behind it. Well, it is the science behind it, but the hardcore math behind it.
yeah, it's funny because I ended up doing maths anyway. Like there's a lot of maths involved in neuroscience. You can't really escape it. um,
Fundamental law of the universe.
Yeah, and then the other reason for neuroscience is I was sort of philosophically interested in the underpinnings, the biological underpinnings of consciousness. I thought that was really interesting, and then became frustrated with that over the course of my degree at how it's not necessarily seen as a scientifically or academically legitimate topic, or it's not a real, it's not a strong line of inquiry in neuroscience. It's a sort of divergent discipline, and neuroscience doesn't really like to touch what we call the hard problem of consciousness. So I at least got some perspective on the sort of the terrain there. But yeah, those are the reasons.
When we jump forward to problem kit, well, you're
Mm.
sitting here and you're talking to founders, and you've experienced these issues yourself when it comes to being empathetic for another idea and not being empathetic for a problem that isn't your own. How has the neuroscience played a role in how you've structured problem kit and the thinking around it?
Well, I brought in, I guess, an intuitive understanding for the flaws in human cognition and the biases that get in the way of our productivity.
What are
So
these biases?
when I think about in the context of Problem Kit, if we consider the goal here to sort of enable people to find more problems and then qualify the ones worth solving, I'm looking at how do we move through our day, through our sort of daily routines and rituals, and what is obscuring or inhibiting our ability cognitively to actually identify and sort of see and then articulate those problems that are solvable. And so that the main thing we're up against here is what we would call habituation. Right. So essentially, you become accustomed to bumping into frictions in your daily routines so often that they eventually become invisible to you. You become habituated to them, right? And so a lot of what I'm doing with Problem Kit is teaching people to essentially open their eyes to be able to see the frictions that they're bumping into to sort of overcome that habituation. So some of that, that's a sort of big one. And then there are other biases like recency bias and availability bias. Availability bias is like, I would say it's quite common in entrepreneurship for people to sort of like gravitate to like really consensus ideas. This is everyone basically building the same things as everyone else. And I see it as a kind of availability bias. It's like those, they seem like fertile grounds, right? They seem really potent spaces to build startups. But what happens is everyone just latches onto the same narrative cycles and then just builds the same stuff and it gets super frothy. And then eventually there's some like bubble that bursts later on. When actually a lot of the success stories that you read about in entrepreneurship, they start with people who are like, they're highly divergent people. They're not necessarily following like consensus narratives on what to build next. They've got really obscure niche interests. So some of it is just getting away from that like perceived availability or like sort of those really like consensus ideas that are just too competitive. And then some of it's recency bias. It's like we just build stuff that we've been thinking about recently rather than being systematic. Or if you're like looking for problems to solve specifically, as I would prescribe, one of the things that we're overcoming is like you're probably going to think about solving problems that you've encountered in the last week. And it's like you can be a lot more systematic than what you've bumped into in the last week. We can be
How would you
really
be more systematic then?
Mm. So essentially, what I teach is a method. I had to name it because can't find anyone else prescribing this kind of methodology, but I call it problem mining, right? So what I teach people to do is essentially take activities that they already do in their own lives or have always wanted to done but never got round to, and complete it, structure it as a project, but with this like problem discovery layer on top, right? So you're taking something you would normally do, and that could be anything, literally anything, from like doing a weekly grocery shop to um, building an entirely new software product, but doing it with this layer of like discovery, like actively discovering and evaluate, extracting problems from that activity as you go. And so that's how I help people because when you structure an activity like that, you can pick the activity intentionally. So there's a process, there's a sort of process of picking activities that are likely to yield problems where you're well positioned to solve them, right? And so doing it that way sort of gets you out of this like cycle, this trap of just like, oh, what have I bumped into in the last day that I actually remember, and which is like very haphazard in my view.
I can imagine it's quite haphazard. You sort of end up clinging on to these ideas that you think are an actual problem in your life,
Mm.
when in
Mm.
reality, it's, as you said, it's just friction. So you
Mm.
get out of this, as you've built this system, you start looking at the world in a different light. Is the act of building the project the quote unquote start of the startup?
Yeah, I actually see it as more fundamental than that. Uh, my motivation is to help people build startups, but essentially it's direction setting, right? I think the fundamental premise of Problem Kit is it's about finding a direction that you have conviction in, sufficient conviction that you'll actually sustain going through multiple iterations or cycles of attempting to build product. Because I mean, it's sort of common knowledge that like your first MVP is a little bit like like making the first pancake. It's gonna come out bad and you throw it away, right? So I'm trying to give people a way to derive a sort of more fundamental direction that they feel really aligned to, so that they can survive that first pancake and get to the second and third one, right?
Makes a lot of sense.
Mm.
You've talked before about doing some research on founders and how many founders, how many of these large, gigantic companies that have started as startups came from the founders' own problems. Is that something that you wanted to spend time and figure out for yourself, or was there a larger issue that we're seeing at hand?
It was a response to pushback I was getting when I started Problem Kit. So I had I won't name names, but individuals had said to me when I sort of previewed the premise of Problem Kit, essentially this, especially this idea that I'm going to be helping people solve their own problems and scratch their own itches.
Hmm.
Some of the early feedback I got was, but if people do that, they'll build tiny products that are only relevant to them and their immediate niche, and they won't necessarily be like hyperscalable startup material, which I was really frustrated by because on the one hand, I've got people in my own circles telling me this, and on the other hand, I've got these great essays from Paul Graham and the likes who are saying like scratch your own itch. And I didn't have any data. I had essays to point to, but they're qualitative and they're opinion based. So I didn't have any data. So I just went out and I thought, okay, how could I quickly test this assumption? So I took a sample of like 100 unicorns, in this case, like 100 unicorns from the past decade in the US, and just took that as like with no additional assumptions on that at all. And I just wanted to ask one question of that data set, which was what percentage of those startups were founded by founders, where at least like one of the founders in the founding team could conceivably have been their own first customer, or they was like
Hmm.
solving their own pain point. Um, that was really useful because it turns out it's like two-thirds. So far from being this like edge case of like it's this nice to have scenario, this like cute little scenario where people are building their products for themselves. It's actually the dominant. It seems to be at least the dominant pattern for even like hyper scalable unicorn startups.
Give me an example of some of these companies. Are we talking about a Facebook? Are we talking about an Apple? Or are these like an Airbnb, for example?
Yeah, I mean Airbnb is a great example because they had this like Airbnb is I struggle with Airbnb a little bit. I don't like to talk about it so much because it's just everyone always talks about Airbnb.
Give me a better example. When you're talking about this piece of research, who do you use as the examples in that?
I actually like to pull from examples on my own network. I find them more because there's a bit of like everyone knows there's lottery winner effect, and it's like
Hmm.
people get tired of hearing about the same success stories over and over again. So I really like to point at people that I've like actually met, especially in London as well, because I'm trying to stimulate the London startup scene as much as I can. So it's like as much as you talk about, the more you talk about people in your own networks, not only are they more um, organic examples, you can also support what your friends are doing. Um, so a good example is I have a friend called Oliver who started a company called Smart Shift Energy, um, and they're still sort of early in their growth journey. But what I really love about what Oliver did was so he tried to reduce his energy bill by as much as possible by moving onto a one of these new smart tariffs. So we have like um, there are, I don't know how much of your audience will have seen of these, but there are smart tariffs now where basically if you shift your energy consumption to off-peak hours, you can reduce your energy bill. But it's really frustrating to actually do that because a lot of like home appliances and the ways that we consume energy don't automatically they're not easy to move into those off-peak hours. So he just basically just tried to do this and figured out what was difficult about that, and then started this company, Smart Shift Energy, which is the sort of demand side flexibility startup. You know, he's doing all kinds of things there, but I like it because it sort of demonstrates this really natural process of like running into something, and also the fact that you can do it intentionally. You can intentionally run into frictions, notice them, and then solve them.
That's incredible when it comes to like solving his own problem and finding this small nugget and expanding from that. I
Mm.
assume that in these instances, when you're looking at the UK startup ecosystem and you're kind of thinking about people instead of going to the US and referencing them, who else do you comes to mind?
Um, who else comes to mind as like really good examples of people scratching
Yes,
their well, one sort of again controversial one is SpaceX,
probably more.
right? So the way that certainly Elon Musk articulates the founding principle for SpaceX is essentially that the economics of spaceflight weren't improving fast enough to outpace existential threats to humanity. So
Right.
I and maybe this is a crude summary of like why SpaceX was started, and I'm sure there's a lot more to it than that. But the reason I like to reach for it as well is because it is a fundamental and like personal anxiety that I think Elon really does have. And the other reason I like to reach for that is I can also use it as an example to explain tractability. So I have this acronym for like how to evaluate a good problem to solve, and it's very personal to you. The acronym is ITCHY, so it sort of plays well with like scratch your own itch. So ITCHY. And it stands for interesting, tractable, clear, high value, and yours. And so the T, tractable, I use the Elon example because this problem of like we need to outpace like planetary level threats with like better, more economical space flight is like a massive, like very high value problem. But when we look at the tractability of that problem, it's very much a function of who you are and what resources you have access to.
Mhm.
So when I meet founders who want to solve massive problems, the first question I ask is, okay, why is this tractable for you specifically? And you look at Elon and the sort of portfolio of businesses that he'd built beforehand and his access to capital. A planet level problem like that is actually tractable for someone like Elon. But would it be tractable for you? You'd have to have a clever answer to that question.
I don't think I can give you a clever answer for that question at this
Well, for
point in
me,
time.
likewise, right? So,
Maybe
but
give me about 50 years and we build a distribution network where, people around the world are tuning in live for this and maybe we can solve that problem together.
Yeah, but I think this is really good hygiene. It's like to look at your access to capital and access to people and access to or proficiency with certain technologies where they're relevant. Because you can answer a lot of that before you've even got an idea for a startup. You can frame that against a problem that you're interested in solving.
What's the goal with Problem Kit long term? Is it to spin it out into its own venture fund or a combination of funds? Or is it to continue to be almost an incubator for ideas that then turn into startups, that turn from ideas into projects into startups?
Well, in terms of the implementation, all of that's on the table. I mean, I started off like just with basically a methodology, a set of ideas that I put into a little like workbook, like a little A6 pocketbook. That just enables me to like give the book out and test the ideas and see like whether people use them or not, which has been a great experiment and a good success, or at least a green light to keep going. Um, I did toy around with I say toy around. I tried to launch an incubator actually prematurely, I would say, a few weeks ago. I just don't have the reach with Problem Kit yet because Problem Kit's still quite new, and I'm operating like in my like very close circles. So like I learned a hard lesson there about the kind of reach that you need to actually pull sufficient volume of applications for an incubator to make it work really well. So that's parked because you asked about that specifically. Um, but yeah, I mean, launching a fund would be interesting. The problem I have with funds is as soon as you raise a fund, you have an investment thesis, whether you know it or not. Hopefully you know it, but like you have an investment thesis, like what kinds of places you'd like to put that money. And the issue when it comes to problem selection is that if a founder is eyeing up a particular pot of money as a starting point, then they end up trying to reverse engineer that investment thesis to arrive at a startup idea. And that is reliably a bad way to get startup ideas. So I want to find if I do eventually raise a fund, I want to do it in a way that doesn't pollute the process of problem selection, but yet rewards when people do that right, and using it as a lead indicator of actually a potential venture success. The
I mean,
actual fund.
sorry, please go on.
Yeah, it's the fundamental goal of Problem Kit is just to sort of it's just to, it's to solve that problem. There's a, to get a little bit meta about it, the problem I'm trying to solve with Problem Kit is that there are essentially a lot of distracting forces that pull entrepreneurs or aspiring entrepreneurs away from really great startups. And I just want to provide some really clear signal on how to like cleanly and methodically do problem selection in a reliable way. If I can contribute that to the literature, um, then that's a success as far as I'm concerned.
You think about it larger than that instead of just, adding to the literature of what makes or how to build a great company, how to build a great startup. Do you feel that Problem Kit long term has to become something larger than just an incubator to facilitate that?
It depends what you mean by larger. Like, is that like how many people are aware of what you're doing? Because, how do you mean larger?
I mean larger in the sense where it's having a considerable impact on the UK startup ecosystem.
Well, I would think globally, actually, there is one way that I look at Problem Kit, and I'm thinking about particularly how generative AI is essentially exploding the capabilities that are available to any given individual right now. So, like the number of tools and your ability to execute on those tools is exploding exponentially. Even your ability to find which tools to use, would have taken days of research, and now it's like a prompt away. So, given that the it seems like we're on a, if not exponential, certainly non-linear track of people, of essentially the amount of capability or the capability power available to individuals to build stuff is really going quite quickly. I think cultivating an ability to choose what to solve becomes more important, right? And it remains a very human process, and it has to, because if we're not the ones with our hands on the steering wheel choosing where to point this power, then that's a scary world to live in, right? So there is a sort of philosophical underpinning here where I'm really keen to make sure that people feel empowered to choose, to basically identify like just what's crappy right now about your life, um, and think about things that way rather than like what's a big attractive market that I could target with a new startup.
So don't go and reverse engineer something. Actually sit with your thoughts, sit with your problems for long enough where they
Mm.
become itchy, and then you can start solving those problems as projects to then transition into startups.
Yeah, I think it's kind of wild that we've moved away from that. I think that's
It
how all
feels
innovation.
like we're getting back to the core principle. Like if we go back to first principles of why you build a company, it
Mm.
feels like we've moved away from, like in your case, you're looking at it from this perspective of, oh hey, go assess the size of the market and reverse
Mm.
engineer it that way. But I think we've all know every great company today that we use naturally in how we use it started from I have an itch that I need to solve, and
Yeah.
that itch is partially something that needs to be solved for the world.
Mm. I think the issue is that company building in itself has become a discipline. I don't know that it used to be thought of as a discipline. And it's because it's a discipline people approach that they optimize for that outcome is like the outcome is build a company. Whereas the outcome for starting startups organically is fix the problem that you've noticed. And then like sometimes that solution is useful to more people than just you. And sometimes it's so hyper scalable that you can reach an entire like planet with that solution. And and you can get valued at, several billion dollars.
Oh, hey,
But
that's
like,
not the goal, though, is it? It's great that we got $7 billion in the bank and like are on the public markets potentially if we IPO. But the
yeah.
goal has always been like continue to fix the problem, like continue to create value for a customer and go back to those core principles. The capital is just a means to an end. It's a great tool for pursuing the vision.
It's just this weird side effect of basically, I think, like the prominence of, for example, YC. That YC have done a great job of like cultivating this community around entrepreneurship, this sort of like playbook, this set of principles and this approach that you can take with like startup school. Um, and you kind of this like negative, like unintended consequence of that is that people take starting to startup, any startup, as the primary objective. And so what do people do when they're looking for, okay, I want to start a startup, it has to be big, therefore I have to start with some massive, attractive market, and then like figure out what to solve for that market rather than starting with their own perspective and position in the world.
Exactly. And it's nothing against YC. I think they've got a great business, right? Like in
Yeah,
terms
that's
of
why I'm
kicking out
surprised.
incredible startups and incredible founders. They're able to incubate that and accelerate that at a rapid rate.
Yeah, it's nothing against YC. Like YC is a wildly successful model. It's
I
just
would love it if they could bring it to the UK in some capacity. It's like everyone can join from all over the world, but it'd be nice. It would be very interesting to see how that dynamic would play out in London.
do we? I don't know that it is. In my view, like YC is a global company. That is in the sense that they have global reach. And like if you live in the UK, you can apply. Like I've got friends that applied to YC and got in. It's like just because that it's not happening here doesn't mean it's not accessible to people in the UK. So which I think is the real question.
Do we
Whether
think it's accessible? Completely, it's accessible.
like it's
I would
accessible to
love to
people.
have different campuses all over the world where this is happening.
Yeah, but that's just patriotism.
Is it though? Or is it actually building the community in that area?
But the community is virtual. It's online. It's like
Oh,
there are
hey,
people in
we love a
London.
good bit of in person these days. The tech bros
Yeah,
have to get out from time to time.
but those communities self-organize, right? I mean, it doesn't we don't like need like ambassadors from YC to come and like start startup communities in London. It wouldn't change anything. People would be just as interested in starting startups, and it would be probably just as accessible as it already is. They just prefer you to go over to the US and incorporate in Delaware or whatever. But it's like it's not that it's not accessible. It's competitive, but it's accessible.
And we love a bit of competition in tech. Alex, I'm looking forward to continuing this conversation. We're going to get you on for multiple segments because I feel like you think very meta, you think very ethereally about these concepts, and I think we're going to have like a standing once a month session with you as get a founder on, have you on, and break down the problems in real time.
Yeah, we
Like,
can
are they
do.
scratching that itch or are they not?
Yeah, that'd be cool. It'd be embarrassing if they're not, though, right?
It would be, but hey, at least we get some great content out of it. We get to stream the Renaissance. Alex, I'll see you soon. Thank you so much for your time, my friend.
Thanks for having me. Great to be here.